time now. Hi, my name is Alex Parikh Briggs, and I'll be the first speaker from the Affirmative debating the resolution that an intercontinental railroad between the United States, Russia, and China would do more harm than good. Before we go into our case, we're going to go over some quick framing, explain what this round looks like. We're going to be saying this is a fact round. We're simply debating the truth or falsity of the resolution. We, as the affirmation, are going to try to prove that the resolution is true. Negation will prove that it's false. We would say that because of that, you should judge the round on net benefits, meaning that, quote unquote, in a hypothetical world where we had this type of intercontinental railway, whichever teams it proves its burden, either we prove that the resolution is true or the negative proves that it's false, should win the round. And as for what an intercontinental railroad would look like, current plans sort of look like this. It would go from China to Russia through Siberia. It would cross the Bering Strait and go into Alaska. There's pretty much no other feasible way to do this in the status quo. And pretty clearly, this would require a Bering Strait tunnel to basically get through that part of the Bering Strait where there's water. Okay, are there any questions on framing? Cool. With that, we'll go into our first contention, which is that of cost. The claim or the argument here is that the project of building the Intercontinental Railroad would cost billions of dollars, and that money needs to be directed to other things right now in the status quo. Let's look at a couple different warrants here. Firstly, we would say that the railroad would cost billions of dollars. Projects at much smaller scales, like a railroad between San Francisco and Los Angeles, are expected to cost about $105 billion. This area that we're talking about in this resolution just covers like a vastly greater amount of area. So it would cost way more than $105 billion. It would cost like five, maybe six-fold amount of that money, which would mean that this would require a significant amount of money to be spent between these three countries. Secondly, additionally, the land that this would need to be developed on is pretty underdeveloped in the status quo. The Bering Strait basically has nothing, and because it's so cold, it would basically have to be done underground in order to prevent the steel from freezing. So right now, it's currently unknown who would pay for the railroad, but China has claimed in the past that it has, quote unquote, the necessary technology and means to pay for the railroad. But we would see that if China paid, this would kind of be a disaster. Because of China's zero COVID policy, the country was obviously an economic ruin from basically 2021 to 2022. They don't really have any ability to pay for this right now, and this would directly take away from their ability to rebound the economy. So far in 2023, there has been slow, modest, but pretty promising economic growth in China after their COVID rules basically went away in December. They went from about 3.8 to 4.7% growth. So as a result, things are getting better in China. If suddenly they were forced to spend billions of dollars on this railroad, we would see that their ability to rebound the economy would decrease drastically, and they would probably have a lot of economic problems that they had in the past. Fourthly, under this contention, if Russia or the United States paid, this would also kind of be a bad thing. The United States paying would basically take away from its $2 trillion discretionary budget, which would almost certainly force them to cut programs in other areas that are very necessary for people in the country. Things such as education, things such as welfare, all of these types of things would require at least some degree of cutting, which would mean that a lot of people who rely on these types of things would suffer. And secondly, the Russian economy is also rebounding in 2023 after a bad 2022. They've been pursuing things like trade. But again, if they would have to spend a lot of this money, they would also be forced to have problems with their economy. So the impacts of this argument are pretty clear. In a world with the railroad, one or more of the countries would suffer economically, right? Let's say that one country pays for the entirety of it, which we think is kind of unlikely. In that scenario, that country would basically just be completely ruined. But in a case where they split between the three countries and, maybe they spend equal amounts, that would still not be great because that would still require billions of dollars from each country. And that would mean that all of those countries would suffer more of the effects. So we would see that them splitting could even be worse because all of the countries face different effects and their economies all suffer because of that. Economy is pretty important. It impacts out to people having good quality of life. When the economy is generally high, it means that it's associated with people having better lives. And as a result, when we see more economic ruin, these people are going to have lower quality of life and a lot of other dangerous impacts that we don't want to have happen. The second argument in today's round is that of leverage. So let's imagine a scenario that the intercontinental railway between the three countries is possible, which we think it's probably not even possible in the status quo, but fiat allows us to kind of say that that's going to happen, and that it's also cheaper than the alternative means of transportations like ships, and that it goes from Alaska to the continental United States. It's still bad because it would boost the United States' reliance on Chinese and Russian goods. Let's explain that now. So firstly, China is a very strong exporter country with a weak currency and a vast array of cheap manufactured goods. It's cheaper to source products from China than it is to get them from the United States. Firstly, China has a crucial position in the global supply chain. It's where components from all over the world are assembled to make things like phones and computers. And we can see that in 2021, trade between the United States and China rose to about $500 billion. Secondarily, Russia and China are political enemies to the United States. So Russia recently launched a war in Ukraine. Obviously, I think we know about that. And the United States countered with billions in sanctions and is sending aid to help Ukraine fight Russia. And secondarily, the United States is at odds with China over basically every geopolitical conflict from Taiwan to the South China Sea to Tibet. So they are not like friends in the status quo. Thirdly, China is decreasing economic dependence on exports to the United States. So, firstly, they're investing trillions of dollars into making themselves the nexus of global trade network between areas from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia to South America. And secondly, a smaller and smaller percentage of China's GDP is coming from exporting to the United States. And fourth and finally, under this argument, relations between the United States and Russia are deteriorating. The US is sending billions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine, which is obviously Russia's main enemy in this quo. And the United States is one of the primary entities responsible for Russia's failure to invade Ukraine, which has obviously crippled the Russian economy. Let's look at a couple different links here. Firstly, creating a railroad between China and the United States through Russia would increase trade with China. We would say that this, assuming it's cheaper, goods would cost even less. Companies would choose to buy things from China rather than the United States to manufacture goods. And secondly, supply chains would be built around these lower prices, making it impossible to ever stop trading with China in the future. And secondly, this gives Russia leverage over the American economy. If there was a political disagreement, Russia could easily shut down a railroad that runs in their territory. So the impacts of this argument, pretty clearly, it makes it harder for the United States to contest things like Russian human rights abuses, also Chinese human rights abuses, right? With what we see with people in China and specifically what they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims. So what we would argue is that when we have a lower ability to check China and check Russia through basically this trade, and basically because we now rely on those two countries, it makes it much harder to solve for issues like human rights and also to check them and hold them in balance for other problems that they're like exacerbating in their own countries. So for the reasons of basically cost and it being bad for economies all around, and also because it's bad for specifically human rights through dependence on those two countries, we think that building a railroad is a pretty bad idea in the status quo. Thank
you. Okay. Before I begin, my name is Eloise Biddle-Gottesman. I use she, her pronouns. I will be the first speaker for the opposition. If you have a POI, ask it verbally, and my computer may glitch out. If I just flat out ignore you, I didn't hear it, ask it again. I'll say something in response. Okay, I will begin my time. I stand on the firmest of oppositions of the resolution. So first, on top of case, we agree with their definitions and weighing mechanism. Okay, so now to get into the opposition case. So our first contention is on increased economic connectivity. So background, in the status quo, goods are primarily sent between the US, China, and Russia via boat or plane. Building an intercontinental railway would substantially increase trade opportunities and allow for the quicker and cheaper movement of materials. So what are the links here? Subpoint A, railways are very cheap. By streamlining the transport experience, materials are able to be transported for much less cost. For example, right now materials are loaded onto a truck in China, to a train, to a boat, to a train in the US, to a truck to bring it to its company. This is simply inefficient. We've removed much of the overhead by just sticking to the railway. And that's point B, railways are fast. Railways aren't that slow compared to planes on the scale of the global economy. So let's do some quick math. ISR trains can operate up to 80 miles per hour. That's about 11 days of travel for a 20,000 mile route. Boats, on the other hand, take 5 to 10 weeks for the same route. That's 1/3 of the travel time, which allows access to a whole nother level of goods that may have been needed to be moved by plane instead, which is far more expensive, to now be transported by train. We need a median solution between 10 weeks and 10 hours, and trains give us that in a cost-effective and fast way. So what are the impacts of this? Cheaper trade spurs economic development, which lowers prices for consumers in the US and all countries, which allows all those countries, which allows companies to pay their workers more, better working conditions, all of these things, which is better for all of the workers and people in those countries. Faster trade allows for increased efficiency in supply chains, more competitiveness in global markets for all countries involved, and allows for a wider range of goods and services to be traded. This leads to more productivity, more innovations, and products being developed and built faster. Our second contention is on providing environmental benefits. So the railway would offer environmental benefits such as reducing the need for air and sea transport, which are more carbon intensive. So, for example, in status quo, countries are trying to shift the Asian North American commerce from expensive fossil fuel burning, ocean polluting ships to zero emission hydroelectric powered electric trains. So it's likely that this would be implemented in this intercontinental railroad. So what are our links? Subpoint A, this would be a good alternative to planes and ship travel, which are far more carbon intensive. A plane is emits 6 times more CO2 per passenger mile than railway, which emit the lowest amount of CO2 per passenger mile. Subpoint B, railways are more energy efficient compared to other modes of transportation, particularly in transporting heavy freight over long distances, which is exactly what this railway would be doing. And electric-powered railways, which, as I said earlier, is by far the most likely choice, will further reduce the reliance on fossil fuels, decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, and contribute to a more sustainable transportation system. And then subpoint C, this will create more sharing of info on renewable alternatives between these 3 countries. So the countries have to work together on this railway. So this will also be a way for them to share information on non-harmful and renewable sources of energy and put this into practice. This makes them more likely to adopt these other alternatives across their countries, which is a net good because it causes less climate change. So what are the impacts of this? Less reliance on carbon-intensive transport systems leads to less carbon emissions, less climate change, less death, less extreme weather, all of the impacts of climate change, which I think we can agree are bad. And then also more environmental cooperation between these 3 countries creates more spread of knowledge and innovation, faster and better solutions, less climate change, which is a net good. And then finally, on the third contention of social connectivity, this railway would be an opportunity for these countries to work together for a mutually beneficial outcome. This leads to less hostility between these countries. So what are the links here? Subpoint A, geopolitical cooperation. A transcontinental railway would foster closer ties and cooperation between these 3 countries. This would lead to more improved diplomatic relations and increased geopolitical stability. This would serve as intercontinental railway would serve as a symbol of cooperation and friendship, helping to build trust and understanding between the nations involved. I'll take it if I have time. Subpoint B, it would promote sustainable development. An intercontinental railway would promote sustainable development along its route by providing transportation and access to previously inaccessible or remote areas. This would create economic development, job creation, and improved livelihoods for local communities in all 3 countries. This would contribute to poverty alleviation and social well-being in these countries. And then finally, subpoint C, mixing of people between countries. As there is now a fast and cheap and accessible way to travel between these 3 countries, this leads to more intermingling of citizens between these 3 countries, which leads to more ties between citizens, less hate, less racism, and less bias between these 3 countries. So the impact of this, more political cooperation and less hostility, less geographical instability, more ties between countries, governments, economies, and people, less hostility between the US, Russia, and China, less chance of war, etc. What's the POI?
So people said that oil or gas pipelines between Russia and the European Unions would boost cooperation and decrease tensions between the 2 countries. Do you think that oil pipelines or gas pipelines, between the European Union and Russia have helped increase relations?
Yes, I think they have. Okay. Now to respond to your case. First, on your first contention of cost. First off, the reason the California Railway is expensive is because the land is already developed where it is going. The Bering Strait and remote parts of Alaska and Siberia have no one living there. Also, billions isn't that much. Temporary ISS costs $150 billion. The US, China, and Russia spend over $1 billion on the military and can more than $1 billion, $1 trillion on the military, and they can divert the funding from that, especially because you are cooperating with a country that you are often in war with, so people are pulling from this funding, causing less chance of war. And then they talk about like the scenario of each country paying, but we say it's almost completely unlikely for one country to be paying. It would be all countries working together, so they wouldn't be like this terrible, impact on one country. And then they talk about how like right now is a bad time to for China to do it. There's no time frame specified. We are saying that like this would do more good than harm. We don't have to do it this year. We don't have to do it next year. We can do it, 5 years from now, but it would cause more good than harm. And we say that the impact on these countries' economies from investing in the railway are outweighed by the economic benefits and the climate impacts. On your second contention of leverage, we turn this. We say cooperation between 3 countries towards a common goal leads to a better government and better relations. Cross-apply our arguments on cooperation. They talk about how relationships are deteriorating between the US and Russia, and we say the problem is we are that we have a reliance on Chinese goods. We say the problem is we already have a reliance on Chinese goods. By making the transportation process cheaper, we are simply helping both countries. In the government world, we are not going to simply stop buying from China. The US is not going to do that. That would be ridiculous for the US economy. We also say that Russian and Chinese leverage on the US already exists in the status quo. Russia shutting down the rails doesn't just hurt the US, it also hurts Russia. It is not like Russia can just destroy the US economy without also destroying its own. Therefore, it doesn't happen. It wouldn't happen in the opposition world. And then, I think that was there. Yeah, okay. So for these reasons, and for the fact that it would be incredibly environmentally beneficial, it would create more social connectivity, and it would create an increased economic connectivity between these three countries, I strongly urge a vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Okay, here, just give me 1 second. So, hi everyone, I'm Colin Goyle. I'm going to be the second speaker for the government side. In my speech, I'm going to be going over the negation case first, and then the affirmative, everything in order. I'll be bringing up a lot of new points about the infeasibility of this project. Yeah, okay. Is anyone not ready? Okay, time starts now. The main problem with all of my opponent's arguments is that they assume that the plan actually happens. They assume that it's possible to build an intercontinental railway between the United States, Russia, and China, and that once it happens, it would be cheaper, it would extend through the US mainland, it would actually be feasible. This is not the case. Fundamentally, it is not feasible to build an intercontinental railway between the United States, Russia, and China with modern technology. It would require building an additional 3,000 kilometers of railroad in Siberia, an incredibly underdeveloped country with little to no infrastructure. And it's so cold there that it literally freezes the steel. So that's why you have to build things like underground tunnels, which increases the cost dramatically. Then you have to build an 87-kilometer underground tunnel through the Bering Strait. You can't build a bridge because it's too long. You have to go underground, 87 kilometers. That would be by far the largest underground tunnel of all time. It is not like the channel between England and France is 10 kilometers long. An 87-kilometer long tunnel which just is not feasible with the current economic trends. Then it would require another 1,200 kilometers of railroad lines to go from the Bering Strait to Anchorage, Alaska. And then what happens? If it goes to Anchorage, Alaska to the United States, it goes to the United States. However, there's no railroad connections between Alaska and the United States. Trump tried to implement a plan where he would spend $122 billion to build what was called the A2A pipeline, America to Alaska, but that fell through because of insufficient funding. Insufficient funding is a massive problem that my opponents don't adequately respond to. Let's go into the line by line on increased economic connectivity. My opponents say railways are really cheap. Railways are really cheap when railways are optimal. Railways are not optimal in areas where there's literally no roads to go and build the railways. It's not optimal in wilderness where there's trees that you have to cut down, there's mountains you have to blast through, and you have to deal with things like your railroad tracks literally freezing. It is not cheaper to build this type of railway, which is why no one is seriously considering doing this plan in the status quo. My opponents say that current methods of transport are really inefficient. You have to do truck to rail to boat to truck. These aren't inefficient. They might be complicated, but they can get goods across the world really easily. Building my opponent's plan would still require going through a rail all the way to Alaska, then a plane or a boat to the United States. It would be a similar cost, or it would be a similar level of complication, and it would be a similar level of time. Additionally, since there exists no railroad between Alaska and the United States, and no one is proposing building that in the status quo, this is only between Russia, China, and Alaska, that means that goods still can't go to the United States, which means that none of the economic benefits actually apply. their B point about how railways are fast, the only advantage of speed is that it's cheaper. This would have such a high cost that it would require a really expensive railroad to make up any sort, or a really expensive like cost to make up any of the potential goods. There's also a bunch of other complications, like the fact that Russia and the United States use different railroad gauges, so you'd have to do some like complicated stuff to deal with that problem. It would not lead to increased economic connectivity because it's completely unfeasible, and it would cripple the country's economies. It would not lead to more economic productivity because it would just connect Russia and China with Alaska, which is hardly an economic powerhouse. On the second point about railroad environmental sustainability, they talk about how it would like make things cost less. It would make things cost more because it would require tons of American or of country expenditure on building this project, which would require higher taxes, which would like put more burdens on the country's economy. On the second point about the environment, all of this relies on the fact that the project is economically feasible. It's clearly not economically feasible, and it's clearly not possible to replace really, really cheap ship travel with railroad travel. You know, traveling by ship is slow, but it's really cheap. They have no evidence for why it's going to be cheaper if you go by rail, which means that people aren't going to be using rail. Additionally, building a railroad through underdeveloped wilderness is environmentally destructive. You know, this track through Siberia would have to go through pretty much pristine wilderness that not many people have gone through. It would not only would it tear through things like habitat reserves, like for example the last remaining refuges for the Siberian tiger, it would do things like dig up permafrost in Siberia, which has a bunch of negative consequences, like releasing diseases that are frozen in the permafrost. Additionally, it's not possible to build hydroelectric trains in the freezing cold because batteries have way worse performance in the cold, which means that it wouldn't actually lead to environmental sustainability. And additionally, no one would use it because it would just be cheaper to use railroad anyway. They need to, and it would also not lead to environmental cooperation because it's not feasible to even happen in the first place. But even if you buy all of that, the fact of the matter is that their third point about social connectivity is completely turned because it would give Russia and China, two extremely undemocratic, problematic countries, massive leverage over the American economy. I asked a question about Russian gas pipelines between Russia and the European Union. They said that these like gas lines were good. Let's go over these gas lines. These gas lines are the primary reason why Russia was able to invade Ukraine because it gave Russia so much economic leverage over the European Union that it made the invasion possible. People proposed building gas pipelines between Russia and the European Union for reasons that for similar reasons as my opponents. It would lead to economic cooperation. It would make things like less hostile between two pretty hostile countries. What ended up happening was that European Union countries were terrified of fighting against Russia, of contesting Russia, because their economies were at jeopardy. And because of that, Russia's been able to get away with things like invading Georgia, invading Crimea, invading Ukraine, launching cyber warfare attacks on countries all throughout the region. It's been massively harmful for political relations, and it has not even helped cooperation at all. Like right now, Germany is refusing to really do sanctions on Russian gas pipelines because of how much their economies depend, which basically allows authoritarian countries like Russia to walk all over the United States, or to walk all over free countries and just like invade things with impunity and just like violate the norms of the international community. Their point about economic development, this would like lead to poverty development or poverty alleviation. It would not, because no one lives there, which means that there's no jobs there because it's so cold. So there would be no jobs. You would literally have to build communities there to create the jobs. They say there's like intermingling between communities. This has little to no impact. On cost, they don't respond to cost adequately. They don't respond to the fact that on any scenario of building the railroad would be massively economically detrimental. It's not a matter of billions, it's a matter of several trillions. What the billion number came from is a railroad between Los Angeles and San Francisco, a very desirable area where tracks don't freeze, and between the same state, building and those states use the same railroad gauges, all of that, it would cost dozens of trillions of dollars to create new technology to build like massively long railroad tunnels. On the second point about leverage, my opponents say that like leverage doesn't matter. My opponents are literally granting Russia and China power over the American economy, like Russia had over the European Union economy, which leads to human rights abuses, like, for example, the invasion of Ukraine. You can expect more human rights abuses in the future if you implement if you build an intercontinental railway. Reliance is not just something that like happens; it's decreasing in the status quo. My opponents are only going to re-entrench it. That's assuming that the plan is possible, which it probably isn't. For these reasons, we affirm. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot. I'm the second speaker for the opposition in this debate. No preference on pronouns, peerwise verbally. If I don't say anything, I did not hear you. So I will just, I don't know, say it again, and I'll probably say something. But without further ado, I'd like to start my speech now. So first on top of case, I want to talk a little bit about this whole idea of like, oh, well, the railroad will never exist in any way because the technology doesn't exist. First of all, for the purpose of this debate, we have to assume that the railroad exists, right? The resolution is not, should we build an intercontinental road? It's saying an intercontinental railway between the United States, Russia, and China would do more good than harm. So the purpose of this debate is basically to say, look, if we built one, if we tried to build one, and if it exists, here's what the impact would look like. Would it do more good? Would it do more harm? Gov literally says in their first speech that they feel that it happens. Therefore, we're having this debate under the presumption that the railway is built. Like that's the whole point of the resolution being phrased in the way that it is. Secondly, on just more specific stuff here, they say it's impossible. Like, first of all, that's using existing technology. We're talking about a potential railway in the future. We can assume that if it's built, then the technology exists. Second of all, they literally say in their first speech that like China has developed this technology for like cold weather railways. So this isn't a problem. And then they talk about the 87 kilometer long tunnel being impossible. And they say the EU tunnel is 10 kilometers long. Judge, the EU tunnel between Britain and like the rest of Europe is 50 kilometers long. It's not that much of an extension, slightly longer tunnel. I'll get to it at the end of this like overview. It's not that much of a problem to build a slightly longer tunnel, especially given the trade benefits that happen between these two countries, especially given the economic benefits that are given to these countries. I'll talk about this later, but basically on cost, what my partner tells you and is what is unresponded to is basically the idea that like the benefits of building this railway just through pure economic considerations basically outweigh any downsides of having a high upfront cost, right? We tell you that the ISS was $150 billion. We tell you that US, China, and Russia spend over $1 trillion on all of their militaries combined. We can find the funding. We can tax the rich. We can, divert military spending, et cetera, et cetera. The funding is possible. This is not the main concern, especially given the economic benefits to these countries. I'll take the POI.
If we're not worrying about feasibility, why don't we build like a giant teleportation ring between Russia, China, and the United States?
Because the resolution is talking about a hypothetical intercontinental railway and not what we should build or when we should build it. For the purpose of this debate, as I said before, we have to assume that the railway exists. We can talk about feasibility as why it would be bad, but we have to assume that the railway exists to have a debate. So that's what we're talking about. On op now. First of all, we talk about economic connectivity. And a lot of their case here is basically talking again about how it's expensive to build. First of all, see our unresponded to analysis that building this would basically be outweighed by the opportunity cost of basically like the huge economic benefits that come to all three of these countries. Secondly, they keep giving this example of California being expensive. We say the reason California was expensive, as my partner points out, is because you're building the railway through like a developed area where you basically have to repurchase that land from landowners. We say that the reason the California railway is expensive, we're from California, is because you build it down the center of the valley, which has like a bunch of farms and you have to pay farmers. That's not why this is expensive. We say, and even if it is super expensive, the countries can stomach it. It's like the three biggest or some of the biggest economies in the world. All of these countries make a ton of money and can justify the cost. They also say it's just like complex. They talk about like the railway gauges. We say variable gauge railways exist. They've been in Europe for forever. Oh, and also just on the point of like electric trains would have batteries and wouldn't work in cold weather. Look at like Switzerland. Like trains exist in cold weather. It's not a huge problem. The technology for building cold trains does exist in the status quo. They even say that it exists in the status quo in their first speech. And then they also just talk about like how, Alaska is not good for connections. We say it's better than basically the status quo, which is huge ships taking 10 weeks to go across the country or tiny inefficient planes flying back and forth all the time, both for the climate and for the people. And finally, they just don't respond to like military funding or taxing the rich. We say these are both ways that this could be funded and both would be beneficial to the people under net benefits. All right, now on environmental benefits. Basically, what they say here is that the project is not economically feasible, and like ships are slow and it's cheap, and then like building a railway is bad for the environment that they're built in. You know what's worse than building like a 20-meter wide railway line through some remote part of Siberia? It's global climate catastrophe. What we're basically saying here is that you need something like this to avert climate change, because otherwise we keep depending on ships which are too slow to be useful for our current needs, or planes which have incredibly high carbon emissions, right? Our actual analysis here on how existing transportation technologies basically are destroying the climate is never actually responded to. They also say you can't build hydroelectric power in the cold because the batteries don't work in the cold. Electric trains aren't battery powered. They're powered by overhead lines. Also, like you could build this hydropower, for example, in the Barrington Strait Tunnel, because you have a lot of ocean current there that would be able to power like hydroelectric turbines, for example. Finally, we say that sharing this information about sharing the contention subpoint about sharing information on renewable alternatives to energy is completely dropped by the government. We say this is a huge impact, right? Because it basically helps all of these countries to avert climate change by sharing technology that didn't exist in the status quo. Don't let them respond in their final speech, because they should have responded this earlier. And also, like, this has the biggest impact in the round, right? Even if it's super expensive for these countries to build this railway, we say it's outweighed by basically, saving the climate and everyone not dying. Or even if we avert climate disaster for another 50, 100 years, that's outweighed by any economic downfall that comes to these countries. Although we also tell you why this would lead to economic prosperity, which is also never really responded to. Finally, on social connectivity, they talk a lot about leverage here, and I just want to do some analysis on leverage, because I think there's a big misconception about how leverage works, both in the status quo and also in this like hypothetical world. Leverage does not exist here because for Russia to basically destroy the railway, it's destroying its own economy, and it's destroying the economy of one of its closest allies, China, right? The reason that China hasn't just been like, no, US, you can't do anything, is because if China, for example, increases sanctions on the US, what happens is that China ruins its own economy because the countries are codependent on each other. The idea is not that but Russia gets this big red button that they can press and just nuke the US economy, but they don't want to press it because they can use it to do leverage. No, it's Russia maybe gets a button that can nuke all three of their economies, including the economy of their closest ally or one of their closest allies. It just doesn't make any sense why Russia would destroy a railroad that is the only main, that as government claims will be the main connection between the US and China. It doesn't make sense. We also say that, they talk about the oil pipelines. We say when Russia invaded Ukraine, they didn't know about the economic catastrophe that would come with it. And look at what happened to the Russian economy. It's absolutely destroyed right now. So basically, we say this is an example of Russia making a horrible judgment, and now their economy is destroyed because of these kind of relations. So it's working. They also finally say that jobs sustainable development wouldn't exist because no one lives in the areas that this railway would be built. That's not true. The railway goes through cities, it goes through islands in places in Russia, it goes through islands along the Bering Strait, for example, all of which have benefits to the economy of the people living there. We also say it has massive economic benefits to the people of the US. And we also say that the mixing of people between countries is good. They say it has no impact. This is just not true. Foreign relations between the US and China and the US and Russia are increased when the people get to know each other, when the countries aren't as hostile to each other. On Gov, really quickly, first of all, on cost, I already responded to a lot of this. The idea that long tunnels are expensive, and they didn't really respond to any of our responses on this case. But anyway, we say that building a tunnel, the length of the Bering Strait isn't that much more exciting than building one from UK to the EU. We also say that basically all of this cost stuff is outweighed by A, the benefits to the economies of these countries, and B, the benefits to the climate, because the climate is literally saving everyone in the entire world. So it doesn't matter whether these countries spend a little more. Finally, and then on leverage, again, see what I said earlier. Leverage doesn't exist because for Russia to, for example, destroy the railway, what they basically have to do is destroy their own economy and also destroy the economy of China. China doesn't want to destroy the thing because their entire economy is reliant on US trade. This is why Chinese sanctions aren't really that effective or don't really exist in the status quo. So for all of these reasons, and for the reason that we basically spur economic development because we save the climate and because we lead to more social connectivity between the two countries and basically more cooperation between Russia, the US, and China, I urge a strong opt vote. Thank you.
Okay. My pronouns have not changed since the first speech. I will begin my time. I still stand on the firmest of oppositions that an intercontinental railway between the United States, China, and Russia would do more harm than good. So just first on top of case on the idea that the plan is like completely infeasible and we shouldn't even really be debating this anyway. So two main responses to this. One, saying that the plan is flat out impossible is abusive and against framers' intent. For the purpose of this debate, we assume it exists and we assume it is possible. The resolution is not should we build one? It's would a railway do more harm than good? Making us defend something that you say clearly could never exist and the tech doesn't exist for it there would not be a resolution about that. And two, we say that we can assume the ability to build this exists if they are building it in the resolution world. And the government did say in their first speech that the tech exists, that China has the tech. So we can assume it exists. Okay. Two main voter issues. First, on interconnectedness between countries. Building an intercontinental railway would substantially increase trade opportunities and allow for quicker and cheaper movement of materials, which has huge benefits for all three countries and even all other countries to buy from the US, China, or Russia. These benefits impact out for the foreseeable future. The US is not going to just stop trading with Russia and China. And we tell you how railroads are cheap, fast, and better alternatives than planes, roads, and ships. They respond to this by basically saying that it is just impossible to do this trade. Again, we say that one, the tech does exist in the status quo. They even say this in their first speech. And even if you buy it doesn't exist, we can assume it would if they were building it. As they are in the resolution. And then two, the cost of this railway would be outweighed by the economic benefits in the future that all of the countries can absolutely afford it in the status quo when we assume, as we should, that all three countries are contributing to building it as it is benefiting greatly all three countries' economies. We also tell you how this would lead to geopolitical cooperation, promoting sustainable development, and create less hate between the citizens of these countries. They respond to this by saying, one, it has small impacts, and two, it creates bad leverage. So first, we say that, one, the benefits to less hate between the countries and the citizens of the country has huge impacts as it decreases racism and bias, which we say is a net good. And two, we already have a reliance on leverage. So we already have a reliance on Chinese goods. By making the transportation process cheaper, we are just helping both countries. And then we also say that Russia and Chinese leverage on the US already exists in the status quo. And Russia, in the case of this intercontinental railway, doesn't just like shut down the railway to have leverage over the US, because that is like cutting off its nose to spite its face. It is going to hurt Russia's economy as much as it's hurting the US's economy. That simply is not how that works. And so these like human abuses, this huge leverage simply wouldn't exist. Okay, and then on environmental benefits, which basically went dropped by the opposition, the railway would by the government. The railway would offer environmental benefits such as reducing the need for air and sea transport, which are far more carbon intensive, and create sharing information on renewable alternatives between countries. And that went flat out dropped by the government. So more environmental cooperation between these countries is crucial as it leads to more spread of knowledge and innovation, faster and better solutions for climate change, which leads to less climate change, which is incredibly net beneficial. I mean, we don't have any countries if we can't live on the earth. And then they only say that one, this railway won't work anyway, which I already responded to. It's against framers' intent to say that. And two, it's bad for the environment around the railway. So we say that obviously climate change is worse for these countries and worse for the environment. It doesn't matter if we build a railway line through a small part of the Siberian wilderness if that wilderness is destroyed by climate change. Additionally, we say that the sharing of information and resources and a decrease in reliance on worse technologies. Look at how many planes fly between China and the US and Russia in the status quo, and the benefits to everyone in the world because of the climate change alternatives outweighs under net benefits. Look at the weighing mechanism. More spending on infrastructure project has no impact when compared to the environmental benefits. So in the end, because cooperation between these countries spurs economic development, cultural development, and helps avert climate change, I urge a strong op ballot on net bends. Thank you.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second. Okay. The order of my speech is going to be a little non-traditional. I'm going to start with the second neg disadvantage. Then I'll do the first disadvantage, then the third disadvantage, and then just half case and weighing. Cool. Great. With that, I'll start time now. The reason that you can vote for the affirmation in today's round is we've overall proved to you that all the benefits that they're talking about in terms of economic connectivity, social connectivity, they're not going to be happening. And even if they do happening, they're going to be marginal at best. But an even greater reason to vote for the affirmation is because they concede a huge warrant and they cold drop it on the second disadvantage, which is when Colin says that people will not use the railroad because ships are cheaper. What we tell you is that it's easier and cheaper to send a boat all the way to the United States than a railroad to Alaska and then ship from Alaska to the continental United States. Ships are really cheap. That's why everyone is okay with it being slow, and things don't need to get here extremely fast. Like, they don't warrant to you why, like, things becoming extremely fast is a huge reason why people are going to transfer from ships and planes to these boats. So as a result, you can extend that warrant cleanly. There's no response to it, which is a reason as to why you vote AF. If nobody uses the railroads, that immediately means that you vote AF because there's absolutely no benefit to it. There's no environmental benefit. There's no economic benefit. There's no social benefit. That's a clean takeout to the entirety of the negation case. But even if you don't buy that, I'm going to go over a couple different things now. So on their environmental contention, they tell you that, like, when we say that this is going to tear through things like habitat reserves, they say that's better than the alternative. The thing is, they haven't proven to you that these are going to be electric trains. When we tell you that, like, these are not going to be electric trains because they're in the cold, they tell you this. They tell you in Switzerland, they quote unquote have trains. They don't say those trains are electric trains. They just say they quote unquote have trains. As a result, we don't know that those trains are electric. So there's no reason to be like believing that these are going to be all electric trains, especially given that because of the cold conditions and because of how underdeveloped the area is, they're going to need to put in the most reliable train they can. They might not be able to do electric, which means that this is a complete takeout to the entire environmental contention. And on top of that, like, this overall destroys habitats. Like, all of that is still clean conceded. When we talk about diseases, which they also concede, the permafrost releasing diseases, that could have a drastically greater impact on, like, the world at large than, the small marginal benefit that they're getting of climate change, even if you buy that it happens. Okay. On their first contention about economic connectivity, basically they're trying to tell you, like, because these countries are now going to be able to communicate with each other through this railroad, they're now going to be able to have a better economy. We tell you a couple of things. Like, firstly, it's not optimal to build here because it's freezing. They tell you, like, countries can stomach the cost. As we've told you, they can't really stomach the cost, and there's no way for them to feasibly do this right now. They try to tell you that the upfront cost of building and basically doing this and wasting all this money is going to be good because it's going to be built back in the future. We've already proven to you, which is completely conceded again, that no one's going to be using these railroads. So as a result, they're not gaining back any economic benefit from making these railroads in the first place. Another problem here is that this goes to Alaska and then it has to get from Alaska to the continental United States. At that point, there is no reason to go through this process where it, like, goes from Russia to Alaska and then gets flown again from Alaska to the continental United States, or like shipped from the Alaska to the continental United States. That process is not going to be economically profitable at all. So as a result, it's not going to be like good for economic connectivity. It's not going to lead to any of the things that they're talking about. They tell you that, like, countries can raise taxes to make sure that this stuff happens. But again, like, if they raise taxes, that's not good for the economy. Like, nothing that they're telling you here is specifically good for the economy. They're just trying to tell you that this would work. But again, this would not provide economic benefits. And on their contention about social connectivity, I think they're really kind of missing the boat on what we're trying to tell you here. They tell you, like, oh, because these countries can interact, that's going to mean that they're more socially connected. They concede Colin's, like, actual reasoning for the gas pipelines pretty cleanly. We tell you that, like, the gas pipelines and stuff like that literally led to Russia's invasion of other countries like Ukraine. They just say, like, oh, Russia didn't know that this would create economic disaster. The argument we're giving you here is that when these countries become reliant on Russia and China, they now become basically situated in this situation where they have a supply chain that's built around these lower prices, making it impossible to ever stop trading with them. This is conceded out of the first speech, which means that they continue to trade with them over and over again, which means it becomes impossible to ever get away from them, which obviously is detrimental to these countries' like own social connectivity, but it's also detrimental to human rights. Okay. On cost, just some quick weighing here. You're going to be weighing probability over magnitude because probability impact should come first, given the fact that, like, if an impact is never going to happen, you probably shouldn't evaluate it. It's pretty clear that, like, this money is going to have to be spent. Like, we're going to have to spend these billions and trillions of dollars on this project. That is a known, like, variable in today's round. We don't ever know because you can either consider it a wash or a win for the affirmation that this is ever going to lead to economic benefits right after, because of the fact that things have to be shipped and then transported from Alaska to the United States, and because of the fact that the railroad's going to cost a ton of money. We don't know that economic benefits are ever going to happen. So as a result, you can just vote off the fact that the actual cost of this would detriment and damage these economies at any time that it's done, whether or not they divert it from the military or not. They have to cut something, which is going to be overall net worse for these economies and therefore net worse for the people. And on the second contention about like tensions, they've conceded just tons of analysis about how supply chains are built around lower prices, making it impossible to stop trading with those countries, which means that they are further linked to these countries overall. And human rights is the biggest impact in the round. So that's probably the one that you should evaluate as most like detrimental, and therefore that's where you should be voting. Thank you.
Okay, good round, guys. Give me a few minutes and I'll give you a decision.
Cool,
That was
thank you.
fun.
Okay, thank you.